There's a moment in High Noon, the 1952 Gary Cooper classic, the one that essentially redefined what a Western could mean, where Will Kane stands completely alone in the middle of a sun-bleached street and realizes that every single person he thought would stand with him has chosen to walk away. His deputies quit. His friends make excuses. Even the people who owe him their safety, their livelihoods, their peace, they close their shutters, lower their eyes, and wait for someone else to handle it. And Cooper plays that realization not with rage, but with something quieter and more devastating. A kind of profound, bone-deep disappointment in human nature. The look of a man who has just watched his entire understanding of community dissolve in real time. That image, one righteous person abandoned by everyone around them, became one of the most durable and emotionally resonant archetypes in American cinema. It got used, referenced, echoed, and reinterpreted for decades. Politicians invoked it. Critics analyzed it. Filmmakers borrowed from it constantly, sometimes consciously and sometimes because that particular emotional shape had embedded itself so deeply into the grammar of American storytelling that it was almost impossible to avoid. And now, 74 years later, a crime thriller called Normal is doing something genuinely audacious with that legacy. It's not borrowing the iconography. It's not doing irreverent homage. It's taking the foundational concept and twisting it inside out until something darker, stranger, and far more cynical emerges from the other side. And the man at the center of it, the man who has to carry that inversion on his shoulders, is Bob Odenkirk. Which, when you think about it for more than 30 seconds, makes complete and perfect sense. Let me give you the setup for Normal, because the premise is doing a lot of heavy lifting before a single frame of footage has to do anything. Odenkirk plays Sheriff Ulysses. And notice that name because it's not accidental. We'll come back to it. A law enforcement officer in a small town who starts pulling on a thread of corruption and discovers that the whole fabric of the community is rotten underneath. So far, so familiar. Corrupt small towns are basically their own subgenre at this point. But here's where Normal breaks away from the formula. The entire town turns against him. Not one villain, not a crime organization, not a shadowy conspiracy with a single point of origin. The town, as a collective, as a community, as a social organism that has decided, with apparent consensus, that this particular sheriff and his particular honesty are problems that need to be eliminated. Ben Wheatley, the director, whose filmography includes Kill List, High Rise, Rebecca, and In the Earth, which should tell you something about his comfort level with darkness and genre blending, describes Normal explicitly as an inverted High Noon. And that inversion is the key to everything. In High Noon, Will Kane is abandoned. The town doesn't help him, but it also doesn't actively hunt him. There's passivity in their betrayal. They step back and let fate take care of the problem. In Normal, the community doesn't step back. It steps forward. It becomes the antagonist. The threat isn't coming from outside the town that Ulysses has been protecting. The threat is the town he's been protecting. And that distinction, passive abandonment versus active hostility, shifts the entire thematic weight of the story into territory that feels much more relevant to where we actually are right now, culturally and politically, than anything the 1952 original could have anticipated. Before we go deeper into what Normal is doing, I want to make sure we properly honor what it's building on, because High Noon deserves more than a footnote. The film was released in July of 1952, directed by Fred Zinnemann, and it arrived at a genuinely fraught moment in American history. The McCarthy era was in full roar. Wick was destroying careers. The Hollywood blacklist was real and operating, and the pressure to name names, to conform, to capitulate, to go along with a system that was poisoning the culture was immense. And into that context, Carl Foreman wrote a screenplay about a man who refuses to run, even when running would be the rational, survivable choice. A man who goes looking for help and finds excuses. A man who stands in the street alone, because standing in the street alone is what integrity looks like when institutions collapse around you. Carl Foreman was himself blacklisted shortly after completing the screenplay. The film's moral, in that context, stops being metaphor and starts being autobiography. High Noon is a film made by someone who knew exactly what it felt like to watch colleagues look the other way. And that biographical weight, that lived-in understanding of institutional cowardice, is what gives it the emotional density that has kept it relevant for 7 decades. Gary Cooper won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The film was nominated for Best Picture. Dmitry Tiomkin's score, with Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darlin', threading through every scene like a heartbeat, became iconic. But underneath all of that technical achievement, underneath the awards and the critical recognition, was something raw and specific and genuinely angry. A question being asked at full volume. What do you do when the community you've given your life to protecting decides your principles are inconvenient? Normal is answering that question 74 years later. And the answer has gotten darker. Now let's talk about the other films orbiting Normal, because Wheatley and screenwriter Derek Kolstad didn't just draw from High Noon and call it done. They built a reference map that is, frankly, one of the most interesting genre cocktails I've seen assembled for a single film in a long time. Fargo, Hardboiled, Evil Dead 2. Take a second with that list, because those 3 films exist in completely different emotional registers and serve completely different storytelling functions. And the fact that Normal is apparently drawing from all 3 simultaneously tells you something important about what kind of movie it's trying to be. Fargo, the Coen brothers' 1996 masterpiece, is a film about the banality of violence. It's about the collision between ordinary, decent, Midwestern human life and the sudden catastrophic intrusion of crime and death and greed. Frances McDormand's Marge Gunderson is one of cinema's great law-keeping protagonists precisely because she's so normal, so cheerful and competent and unimpressed by the darkness she has to wade through professionally. And what Fargo ultimately argues is that the darkness is always there, right underneath the surface of ordinary American life, and that the people who maintain order and decency do so through an act of constant, deliberate will against a current that would pull them toward chaos if they ever stopped pushing back. Sound familiar? Because that's also what Normal sounds like it's doing with Ulysses. Hardboiled, John Woo's 1992 action masterwork with Chow Yun-fat, is a different kind of influence. That's about kinetic action choreography, about the almost balletic quality of violence when it's filmed with total commitment to its own internal logic. Hardboiled contains some of the most technically sophisticated and emotionally overwhelming action sequences ever put on film. If Normal is drawing from that, it means Wheatley is building toward action set pieces that aren't just functional, they're expressive. Violence as language. Movement as meaning. That's a high bar to aim for. And it's an interesting choice for a story that is fundamentally about community betrayal rather than simply individual combat. And then there's Evil Dead 2, which is Sam Raimi operating at the absolute outer edge of tonal control. Horror and slapstick and genuine terror and dark comedy all mashed together so completely that the seams are invisible. Evil Dead 2 is a film where the protagonist fights his own possessed hand, and the scene is simultaneously funny and horrifying and weirdly heroic. If Normal has any of that DNA in it, any of that willingness to let tonal extremes coexist without either one canceling the other out, then we might be looking at a film that does something genuinely unusual, make you laugh and make your stomach drop at almost the same moment. The connective tissue between all 3 influences is a very specific kind of protagonist. Ordinary, competent, decent, placed in an extraordinary, escalating nightmare that they navigate not through superhuman ability, but through sheer stubbornness and moral clarity. And that brings us, inevitably, back to Bob Odenkirk. Let's be real about something. Bob Odenkirk's action career is one of the most improbable and genuinely delightful third acts in recent Hollywood history. This is a man who spent the first major phase of his career as a comedy writer, writing for SNL, co-creating Mr. Show with David Cross, building a reputation as one of the sharpest satirical minds in the business. Then Better Call Saul happened, and he spent a decade demonstrating that he could do dramatic depth that would make actors a third his age genuinely envious. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Nobody happened. Nobody, released in 2021, is the film where Odenkirk transformed into something nobody saw coming. He plays Hutch Mansell, a mild-mannered suburban dad with a secret violent past, who gets pushed past his limit and proceeds to dismantle an entire Russian mob operation with the quiet, methodical efficiency of someone who has always known exactly how to do this and has simply been waiting for the right provocation. And Odenkirk is extraordinary in it. Not because he plays it as a power fantasy, though it works on that level too, but because he plays the cost of it, the way violence lives in the body, the exhaustion, the damage, the way a man who has been containing this capacity for a long time almost seems to grieve when he has to let it out again. Odenkirk trained seriously for that role. Extensively. He learned close-quarters combat, studied the physical grammar of movie fighting, got his body ready for something it had never been asked to do before. And the result was a performance that was completely credible precisely because you could see the preparation underneath it, not the technique, but the commitment, the decision to take this seriously. Normal takes that foundation and adds something. Sheriff Ulysses isn't Hutch Mansell. He's not a man with a buried violent past, suddenly uncaged. He's something more complex. He's someone who has built his entire identity around a set of values: law, order, protection, community, and is now watching that community weaponize itself against those very values. The action here isn't about releasing something previously contained. It's about defending something being actively dismantled. That's a different emotional engine entirely, and it requires a different kind of performance from Odenkirk. What the career arc tells us is that Odenkirk has a specific genius for playing men in the middle of identity crisis. Saul Goodman is Jimmy McGill trying to outrun the person he's afraid he actually is. Hutch Mansell is a man trying to stay buried and eventually accepting that burial was always temporary. And Sheriff Ulysses, based on what we know, sounds like a man who has staked his identity on a certain understanding of where he belongs and what his relationship with his community means, and who is watching that understanding be destroyed in real time, violently by the very people it was supposed to protect. That's rich territory. That's the kind of character who can carry a film entirely on the weight of his internal life, even in the middle of action sequences. Now let's talk about Derek Kolstad. Because the screenplay is where everything lives or dies, and Kolstad's track record is specific enough to tell us something useful about what to expect. Kolstad created John Wick. He wrote the original screenplay and the sequel. What he essentially did with that franchise was take a premise of almost absurd simplicity: retired hitman, dead dog, stolen car. What does that mean for Normal? It means the town itself is probably not generic. It's probably a place with specific realized rules, a particular kind of corruption that has developed its own internal logic, its own hierarchies, its own reasons for working the way it works. The town turning against Ulysses isn't random community hostility. It's probably systematic, organized, with a history, and uncovering that history, understanding why the town is the way it is, and how deep the rot actually goes, is probably as much a part of Normal's narrative pleasure as the action sequences. Kolstad writing an inverted High Noon is almost too perfect a match. High Noon's central dramatic tension is structural. One man, one clock, one incoming threat, the question of who will stand with him. Kolstad understands structural tension. He understands how to make a confined situation feel endlessly escalating, how to keep raising stakes in ways that feel inevitable rather than arbitrary. Give him Ben Wheatley's visual ferocity and Bob Odenkirk's character actor depth, and you have a creative team that is, on paper, almost suspiciously well-suited to this exact material. Let me get into the thematic stuff now, because I think Normal is trying to say something that goes well beyond genre entertainment, and I want to name it. Let's end on this. Gary Cooper stands in that street in 1952, and the clock is running, and the train is coming, and nobody is coming to help him. And what makes that image so enduring, so emotionally honest, so genuinely painful to watch even now, is that we recognize it. We have all had a version of that moment. Smaller, usually less cinematically lit, but structurally identical. The moment when you realize the people you counted on have made their calculation and you didn't come out ahead. The moment when doing the right thing means doing it alone. Normal is taking that image and asking what happens in the sequel to that moment. What happens after the train arrives, and will Kane is still standing, and he has to go on living in that town, or has to decide whether he can? What happens when the test of character isn't the showdown, but the aftermath? When the enemy isn't riding on a train, but already sitting in the diner drinking coffee and nodding hello, while privately hoping you don't make it to sundown. Bob Odenkirk is exactly the right actor for that story.